Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the fourth session of the Lodha Genius Program Thought Lab session. The session, as you can see, is titled Consciousness at the Crossroads of Humanity and AI. And our guest speakers for today are Anil Seth, who's a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex. We also have Susan Schneider with us, who's a professor of philosophy at Florida Atlantic University. And the moderator for today's session is Professor K. VijayRaghavan, who is the chair for Science Advisory Council, Ashoka University, and also the former principal scientific advisor to the government of India. Just to give a reference of our program, the Lodha Genius Program is basically a joint initiative between the Lodha Group and the Ashoka University. And the idea of this program is to nurture young minds from the ninth graders to the 12th graders and equip them with skill sets and knowledge so that they become mindful and compassionate citizens who go on to solve the smaller to the biggest challenges, pressing challenges in the society, and also to make tangible impacts. So, as part of the Lodha Genius program, we've started this offshoot called the Thought Lab series, where we want to engage with the experts all across the globe to have like these interesting conversations. And the idea for these sessions is for people to take back something to their lives, to their works, and again, think about these topics in depth. I'm going to talk about just some housekeeping rules. This session is going to last for 1 hour. Half an hour, 35 minutes will be dedicated to this discussion between Anil, Susan, and Vijay. After which we'll open the room for Q&A. But I would still suggest if the attendees have questions, you can drop it in the Q&A section, and please refrain from dropping your questions in the chat box. And it's easier in the Q&A sessions because we can take them up later. And if you see a question in the Q&A box which is similar to yours, please just upvote it so that just it comes on the top of the Q&A box. Now I'm gonna hand over to Vijay. Vijay, you can take over the session.
Thank you, Utsav, and warm welcome, Susan and Anil. To our audience, Susan Schneider is a philosopher. She's written wonderful books on AI. One of the books is and consciousness. One book is Artificial You, AI, and the Future of Your Mind. That was published as long back as 2019, and the world of AI is changing dramatically since then. So we'll hear about that from her. Anil Seth is a neuroscientist who combines the ability to understand how the brain works with trying to interpret how the brain achieves consciousness. He's written a wonderful book. I don't have Susan's book with me, unfortunately. I have it on Kindle, but I have Anil Seth's book with me, Being You, and it's a terrific book. And if you read these books, very accessible, you will learn a lot about an extraordinarily exciting and complex field. But over to business. Welcome, Susan, first. And Susan, could you give us a brief summary of your views on AI and consciousness? And then I'll go over to Anil similarly.
Sure. Brief summary. Okay. And thank you for having me. It's really great to be here with you all and to discuss these important issues. Sounds like a wonderful program, by the way. We should all be worried about the future and how to approach it mindfully. Well, let's see. Back in 2019, in Artificial You, I was worried about how the future was going to play out. And in the first 4 chapters, I discussed the case of machine consciousness. I took a wait and see approach. So I believe that we have to divide the issue into a number of cases. So, for example, chatbots, which weren't as impressive then, we just had incipient models, but that's one case to discuss. Another case would be more biological systems, which I can talk about. The thing is, we can't just answer the question, is AI consciousness possible without really thinking through the different scenarios very carefully. So the first thing I do in the book is I discuss the case of the normal kind of functionalist approach to machine consciousness, in which people like Ray Kurzweil, and in the context of philosophers, a lot of computational functionalists talk about the possibility that machines can be conscious in terms of a view called multiple realizability, or in the case of Nick Bostrom, he sometimes talks about substrate independence. And the idea there is that consciousness is not substrate dependent. It all can be realized, in principle at least, in lots of different systems. And I go through that very carefully, talking about different examples. Like, I love these neural replacement cases where you know, an individual can have like one neuron after the next replaced by a hypothetical AI neuron, right? And at the end of the day, says the thought experiment, why not think that that individual, which would then be a form of artificial intelligence once all the neurons are replaced, would be a conscious being? And I say, that's conceptually possible. It's logically possible. And, you know, I point this out in an entire chapter. It's actually chapter 2 of the book. So I'll quote page 25. Philosophers distinguish between logical and conceptual possibility of machine consciousness from other kinds of possibility. Lawful possibility requires, for something to be possible, that building something is an accomplishment that is consistent with the laws of nature. Within the category of the lawfully possible, it is further useful to single out something's technological possibility. That is, whether in addition to something's being lawfully possible, that is compatible with the laws of nature, it's also technologically possible for humans to construct the artifact in question. And then I say, although the broader discussions of that kind of conceptual possibility are interesting, I've stressed the practical significance of determining whether the AIs we may create can be conscious. So I have a special interest in the technological possibility of machine consciousness, and further in whether AI projects would ever want to build it. So the wait and see approach then goes into, in numerous chapters, the different scenarios. So, for example, what about, you know, an AI project, say over at Google, where they're worried about public reception, and so they tone down consciousness? And what about, in another case, a situation where the AI has recursive self-improvement algorithms, and it decides that the most efficient way to create itself is actually by not being conscious. Consciousness in the human case is associated with some serial, very slow processes in the brain and a lot of views. Here I'm thinking mostly of the global workspace theory and whatnot. So I think there are a lot of design questions, and that's even on the assumption that conscious AI is compatible with the laws of nature. And there I go into, you know, questions about whether the substrates would even be the kind of things you can create artificially through silicon or some other product. And that's really a matter of the deep-rooted causal powers, right? For me, consciousness actually has to do with issues involving quantum mechanics. I have a new paper on that. I didn't go into that in the book, though. But in any case, I think that we can't just answer the question, can machines be conscious, with one simple answer. We have to go on a case-by-case basis. We don't currently know. I can go into, you know, questions from the Scientific American piece about the crowdsourced neocortex theory later, if you want. But, you know, I have specific things to say about the chatbots and about how to test for consciousness as well. But that's the gist of the book from 2019.
All right. Thank you very much, Susan. We'll come back to this. Very, very many questions popping up on what you just said. But let's first listen to Anil and what he has to say. Over to you, Anil.
Thanks, Vijay, and thanks, Susan. So echoing, thanks for inviting me and putting this on. It's great to be here. Thank you. And good afternoon from the UK. So my work is primarily consciousness, but also I'll sort of start there and finish with a couple of things about AI. So consciousness, firstly, is kind of hard to define, but I think broadly what I mean by it anyway, and hopefully this will allow us to talk about roughly the same thing. It's any kind of subjective experience, the redness of red, the paininess of pain. Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, called it, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. It feels like something. Now that is, on the face of it, feeling like something, that's different from being smart. Consciousness and intelligence are different. Susan, I know this is a distinction that you're very keen to emphasize too. So that already gives us a clue that just making machines smarter is not necessarily going to make them conscious. Consciousness and intelligence are not the same thing. Now, how do we begin to understand consciousness in terms of our understanding of the natural world? It seems very difficult. David Chalmers, another philosopher, very famously put it as the hard problem. How does physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. My perspective is to not try and find some sort of magic solution to the hard problem, but to try and dissolve the hard problem in a way that scientists previously dissolve or partially dissolve the problem of life. You just explain its properties in terms of things happening in brains and bodies. Explain why one experience is the way it is and not another way, why vision is the way it is and not like emotion or something. And the way I do that, and this is the core of being you, is to understand the brain as a prediction machine, as always making predictions about what's going on out there in the world or in here in the body. It's trying to solve this problem of Bayesian inference, infer the causes of its sensory signals. And I use that as a way of understanding what every experience is like. It's a form of perceptual prediction, or as I put it, controlled hallucination. Not something that's arbitrary, but something that is actively generated, actively constructed by the brain, but geared to the world and the body in ways that are good for our survival. Now, you can run Bayesian algorithms on computers, no problem. People do all the time. And a lot of generative AI is based on this too. But in its biological implementation in brains, the place I end up getting to is that actually the reason brains are prediction machines in the first place is to control and regulate the body, to keep us alive. And that actually that imperative goes right down into single cells, into our metabolism. So in this sense, there's a very intimate dependency in the consciousness as we know it between what brains are and the fact that they're made of stuff that's alive. It's a philosophical position often called biological naturalism. There's an intimate link between biology and consciousness, at least in the things that we know are conscious. And then I apply this to sort of all the different aspects of conscious experience, free will, self, and so on. So the question is, like, what then can we say about consciousness in AI? And I'll just finish with this. And I'm very, very skeptical. I think we can't definitively rule it out. Certainly don't know that it's there, but we also know more than nothing. I think it's we don't throw up our hands and say we don't know anything. So I'm quite aligned with this wait and see and case by case approach, because understanding where consciousness is in the universe, the problems look different, whether it's AI or whether it's a bunch of brain cells we call an organoid, or a human patient after brain injury. They're all different cases. With AI, I think we have to be very careful, and Susan has already mentioned this, about being seduced by our psychological biases. When something speaks to us, we kind of conflate that very easily with intelligence and with consciousness. We're very anthropocentric creatures. People worry about consciousness in Claude, but not in AlphaFold, interestingly, even though it's basically the same thing. And then there's a deeper question, which we can talk about, which is computation enough for consciousness? So this is computational functionalism, which Susan also mentioned. Here, there's, I think, an interesting debate to be had. I feel it's a very big assumption, and it's intimately tied up with this notion of substrate dependence. In computers as we have them, we've got a sharp substrate independence, a sharp distinction between software and hardware. That's why computers are useful. The short story here is in brains, we have nothing like this. We have no sharp distinction between mindware and wetware. And there, in my view, much less motivation to think that computation is the right way to describe what's happening inside brain. It's certainly not exhaustive. And then just to finish, so I think we can be skeptical. There are reasons to be skeptical that computation is sufficient. There are reasons to think that consciousness might be closely tied to our biology and put them together. Skeptical of conscious AI, but of course you can make AI increasingly brain-like. You can make neuromorphic systems, you can make hybrid systems. But while I don't think it's going to emerge with the next iteration of ChatGPT, I'm much more worried about what happens when we start building organoids, neuromorphic systems. And the question for me is, how brain-like does an AI have to be to really move the needle on the credence for it being conscious? And there are a bunch of ethical implications that differ between whether systems really are conscious or whether they just inevitably seem conscious to us, whether it matters for their own sakes or for our sakes. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for pointing out what you see the difference between intelligence and consciousness. In today's world, we have access to computational capabilities to become more and more intelligent, as it were, because we can compute, understand kinds of things which we couldn't a short while ago by talking to our phones, to the web, querying AlphaFold, which tells you about protein structures, for example. Now, Susan, you mentioned about the potential theoretical possibility, without violating physical laws, of taking out individual nerve cells in a thought experiment and replacing that with computational capabilities, equivalent computational capabilities, and seeing when in such a thought experiment consciousness is retained in the system, even though it has more and more machine-like components. There possibly is another way to ask another thought experiment, start removing neurons and ask whether when consciousness goes away, is consciousness a property of the entire brain or a small number of neurons or parts of the brain? So let me first ask you, Susan, the first part. You decide in your article in Scientific American, the recent one, you mentioned that about AI chatbots as a crowdsourced neocortex that mirrors human thought patterns. And could you elaborate on this concept and what it means, and why should one be careful about assuming, like Anil also pointed out, that these chatbots are conscious or not, indeed?
Oh, sure. So basically, the crowdsourced neocortex idea it goes back to the days when I was a student of Jerry Fodor, who was arguing against the connectionists, who then, Hinton and that crowd, who then created the field of deep learning. And, so I used to teach with Jerry, how these early systems thought. And of course, Jerry Fodor would famously have tantrums arguing that they didn't think. And in my first book with MIT Press, I argued that they did, right? So basically, we're seeing this come out now with anthropic studies in circuit tracing. So the idea is that as the systems get, higher parameter and more sophisticated, higher quality data, so they crawl so much of human data that they essentially mirror not the thinking of one person. And here I mean to set aside the issue of consciousness entirely. I'm talking about intelligence. And in particular, I'm talking about the conceptual structure of groups of people whose data they crawled. So what they do is they have concepts in a way. I mean, philosophers will argue about whether we call them concepts, but I'm just going to set that issue aside. But they basically have weighted connections that mirror the connections that the groups of humans had, essentially, because all their data was crawled. So I'll give you an example to make it tangible. if you have a large language model like Claude or GPT, and it thinks about, what I mean think in a very loose sense, dog, its weighted connections are closer to cat, furry, and so on than photon and other concepts. So I call this the crowdsourced neocortex idea. So a system with intelligence that emerges from training on extraordinary amounts of human data, enabling it to effectively mimic the patterns of humans. That's what I mean by crowdsourced neocortex. So as the chatbots grow more and more sophisticated, their internal workings come to mirror those of human populations whose data they assimilated. Rather than mimicking the concepts of a single person, they mirror the larger groups of humans whose information about consciousness even was included in the training data, as well as the larger body of research and philosophical work on consciousness. So that's why sometimes, it depends on the system and what reinforcement learning was done to allow or disallow it to talk about consciousness. But you see situations when the chatbot asserts it's conscious, asserts it has feelings, right? And it does so very, very convincingly. But the thing is, we have what philosophers call an error theory. We have a reason now for knowing why they behave the way they do, why they will make avowals of consciousness, right? And it doesn't say anything one way or the other about whether they're conscious. So to figure out if they're conscious, we have to go beyond what they say. We have to run independent tests and look at considerations like what Anil brought up and what I brought up earlier.
So how would you distinguish between a chatbot which says it's conscious and it has empathy with you, and a human who says they have empathy with you and is lying? So how do you know whether, the human actually not behaving like a chatbot and just responding to circumstance and giving the best possible answer and doesn't have any higher level feeling which they claim to be expressing?
Well, I'll let Anil go to that because he has a whole, biological naturalist approach, right? And my own view is very sympathetic to that. I think in the human case, there's, very rich neurobiological resources that indicate that these are conscious beings. Sociopaths are tricky because they don't have empathy, but nevertheless, they're conscious, right? Yeah. But in the case of an AI chatbot, they lack the biological underpinnings. So it's not that we can definitively say they're not conscious. Like John Searle, the person who coined the expression biological naturalism, was my professor at UC Berkeley. And, he stressed that it had to be biological to be conscious. Now, that's where I think Anil and I may depart a bit, because I'm saying we should take a wait and see approach. I don't think the chatbot avowals of consciousness say one thing definitively. I think we just need to investigate the issue. The fact that they say that they're conscious and they have this crowdsourced neocortex that we see doesn't mean that we should take it seriously. So we should reject the view that, as people put it here in North America, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. There's this saying. I think we should reject that. Just because they're functionally like us does not at all entail that they're conscious. And in fact, this is a line I'm seeing all over the place with the transhumanists right now, who seem inclined to just go ahead and think that these systems are conscious. I don't know. What do you think, Anil?
I know.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree too much. It's not that I'm 100% convinced that consciousness is only possible in carbon-based living systems. But I think it's, for me, the onus is on to then explain or try and strengthen that argument, try and understand if that is the case, then why would that be the case? Now, the early forms of this biological naturalism didn't really give a positive reason for why that might be the case. It was more just like a statement that it is the case. And for me, that's not very satisfying. So I see a lot of reasons to be more skeptical than I would say people in general about computers being conscious, because again, another way to put my point from earlier is I think we've overextended the useful metaphor of the brain being a computer to kind of confuse it with it actually being a computer. And it isn't. Metaphors are just metaphors. And we always get into trouble when we mistake the map for the territory. And, we don't get confused about the fact that a computer simulation of a weather system, remains dry, and, you don't get real water and rain and wind. You need the actual stuff. And so it may be that a computer simulation of the brain, even if it's very, very detailed, would only ever be a simulation. It would only ever be a map rather than the territory itself. To think otherwise already requires assuming that computation is enough. And for me, that's a very, very big assumption that, interestingly, I'm already seeing this sort of movement from like it being such a deeply held assumption that it wasn't even necessary to state it, to now it being at least recognized as like, well, we have to assume this because otherwise what are we going to do, to now it being a little bit more held under scrutiny as we focus not on the similarities between brains and computers, but on the differences between them. That changes the kind of psychological attraction of this whole view. But so, and then on the other hand, we've got to explain, well, why would it be biology? And maybe if biology matters, it's not necessarily carbon-based, or it could be other ways to realize the same necessary and sufficient properties. And we don't know quite what that breadth is, but it makes sense, at least to me, to reduce our credence in computation being enough and increase our openness to it might be dependent on biology. After all, the only examples of conscious systems for which there is consensus agreement of their being conscious are all, at the moment, living systems. So it's not a radical assumption to start with.
It's not a radical assumption, but would you then stretch that to say that there are simpler biological systems other than human, which are conscious? And if so, how far would you go down in evolution? And if that's the case, if there are simple cases, then is that theoretically possible that one can simulate the simplest case and have at least that form of consciousness?
Let me answer the last bit of that first. So the question of whether simulation would be sufficient to instantiate a simple form of consciousness is totally orthogonal to the question of how far down the evolutionary tree you can go. If computation is sufficient for consciousness, the answer is yes. If it isn't, the answer is no. I suspect the answer is no, but it will just be a model of a simple organism. Now you can, for aspects of intelligence, simulation is enough, because intelligence is defined in terms of what something does, and by the nature of what computation is, in a Turing sense anyway, it's an algorithm. It takes inputs and maps them to outputs. You can get intelligent behavior of some form through computation. We have existence proofs of that already in AI. You don't have that security when it comes to consciousness. It's just not clear that consciousness is a matter of mapping one set of numbers to another. That's a very, very strong statement. Now, how far down the evolutionary tree it goes, this is a really hard question. When I say that I think life is important, I don't mean that I think all life is conscious. There's a difference between biological naturalism and what people call biopsychism, which is the thesis that everything that is alive is conscious. I don't think that necessarily the case. The honest answer is we don't know, because we don't have a consensus theory of sufficient conditions for consciousness, even in biological systems. So it may be that things that in mammals, consciousness depends not on the whole brain, but certainly on a sort of intact thalamocortical system. Organisms that lack that may be able to be conscious in some other way. And to answer that question, my feeling is we've got to understand what the function of consciousness is. Theodore Dobzhansky said, nothing in evolution makes sense except or biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And if we can understand what problem being conscious is solving for us as biological organisms, even if there are other ways to solve that problem in principle, we can understand what it's doing for us in biology. Then we can look to see which other animals are solving the same kinds of problems. And then we can start to see if whether there's a mapping between the underlying mechanisms and make our inferences that way. I personally think I start to get worried when we start talking about insects and bacteria and things like that. I'm not sure. C. elegans with 302 neurons. I just don't. I don't. But maybe I'm being too anthropocentric still. So I don't know. But we have to sort of go from what we know and inch our way out slowly. Always asking, am I just building in a human bias, or am I actually open to a multiple realizability, if not a substrate independence? Multiple realizability, it can be within biology. There's just different kinds of brains that could be conscious. Substrate independence is the stronger claim that you could have something made out of a completely different stuff, be it silicon or cardboard or whatever it might be.
So I'll come back to you, Anil, but let me ask Susan, taking on Anil's point too, if one says computation is not sufficient, but computational capability is necessary, would you say that, Anil? Necessary, but not sufficient?
I think not sure. I think certain amount given that the function of consciousness for me is something to do with integrating a lot of different signals with the relevance of staying alive. Now that's a complex dynamic process that we can model computationally, and the computational model would not be simple, right? But it doesn't mean that the brain is doing it computationally.
Right. So to Susan, supposing one were to start replacing these variety of biological sensory inputs which one get, vision by visually stimulating the eyes directly, sound, taste, smell, and so on in multiple machine ways. Would the brain have a conscious perception from all of that, of the world around, if all these sensory inputs were identical and indistinguishable from what one would do, quote unquote, naturally?
So here, I think it's important to go back to that thought experiment. Remember that philosophers love to answer that at the armchair without doing any empirical investigation. And it does seem logically or conceptually possible, absolutely. And these kinds of replacement arguments have been around for a long time. But just because it seems conceivable and non-contradictory does not mean it's compatible with our technology. And I think that's why I take a wait and see approach. Now, if I may go back to the big question here, is computation sufficient for consciousness? Here's one thing I want to call attention to that I think the students might enjoy. And Anil, you might find this fun too. I mean, the universe is not a digital computer, okay? So phenomena in nature is quantum. The biological arena has quantum properties. In fact, it all depends on quantum mechanics. So when we talk about computationalism with respect to consciousness, I think we need to stop fixating on computational functionalism, which is usually framed in terms of generic philosophical views, and get to the harder question, which is, what's the quantum nature of consciousness? Now, here's something fun. I bet some of the students have heard of the simulation hypothesis, the idea that we could be in a computer simulation. Okay, if we are, and I just wrote a piece on this for Philosophy and Philosophical Research, you guys can grab it, I'll pop it on my webpage. If we're in a simulation, we're being simulated by a quantum computer, right? So if we want to ask whether it's possible to build a conscious machine, we need to look at the relationship between quantum theory and consciousness, right? And we also need to ask if there's anything that goes beyond what's possibly computable by a quantum computer. And here, people like Roger Penrose have offered Gödel arguments and whatnot, right? But I think that's kind of the hot thing to be thinking about right now. And so to go back to the replacement case, I think the hot thing to think about is, suppose I build a chip, say I have this really futuristic AI lab. What kind of properties would the brain chip need to replace actual neurons in an area of the brain that underlies conscious experience? What would it need? And would it require a different something? Would it allow for us to build something that isn't biological? And I think the answer may be no. And that's where my view becomes like Anil's. It becomes, you know, a situation where we have to entertain biological naturalism.
So let me ask you, Anil, I'm a bit puzzled because, you know, if you look at a human brain or a worm's brain, well, let's leave the worm's brain aside. If you look at a human brain, different regions of the brain have nerves, neurons and neuronal connections and synapses, and it's neurons and synapses all the way up and down. If you pick up a particular region of the brain, the thalamocortical region, for example, and dissociate the neurons there, they would look no different, you know, as far as we can characterize, from neurons in another part. It's their circuitry and their function which make them distinct, and not properties of individual neurons themselves substantially. I mean, there are many, many kinds of neurons, and there will be some differences. But given that, how then do different regions have roles in consciousness aside from being involved in integrating and guessing about the world outside through sensory inputs? And if that is the case, then surely what is the role of the biological substrate rather than serving as a hardware role with layer on it our experience of the world, our ability for language and so on, being the software?
So I think we've got this highly impoverished view of the brain in that kind of characteristic as a sort of bunch of swappable in and out neurons. You can just, you know, plug and play neurons. You just connect them in different ways, and that's a view of the brain as a kind of, it's just a biological hardware to implement some mental software. And there's a reason people think that way. I mean, it's convenient. Back in the 1950s, it's convenient. Well, that's a big point. So back in the 50s, McCulloch and Pitts, Pitts and Warren McCulloch, proved that you could have artificial neural networks like this that really simplified the biological complexity of a neuron, and you could get everything that Turing computation gives you. Now, this is why a lot of AI today is using these artificial neural networks. They are what you call Turing complete. They can implement any algorithm. That's really powerful. But as Susan said, it's not everything. Like, this space of digital Turing computation is just one small space, not only of possible computations, but of possible dynamics altogether. Anything that is continuous, stochastic, that's strictly outside the realm of Turing computation. You can always simulate it with a computer, but it's not itself computation. So we have this kind of caricature of looking at the brain through Turing glasses, which I think misleads us. In fact, neurons are very complex. They're not all the same. Of course, they're different types, but they're incredibly complex themselves. There are also glial cells. There are neurotransmitters flowing around. And the brain is as much a chemical machine as it is an electrical machine. Now, this actually puts a little pressure on this neural replacement argument. Now, I think you were very wise to distinguish this sort of logical conceptual possibility from the technological possibility. Can we build it? There is actually another kind of possibility, which philosophers call nomological possibility, which is sort of, and I wasn't sure whether that's what you had in mind, Susan, but I think it's really important. It's possible given the laws of nature as they are, not given sort of, you know, some other choice for the laws of nature that might still not involve logical contradiction. And it's a subtle point, but I think it's important because I am not persuaded that neural replacement is possible nomologically. And that's because the brain is, the more you look at it, the more entangled, intertwined across time and space and scale everything is. There's a philosopher called Rosa Cow in Stanford who writes about this very nicely. The conclusion she reaches, and I'm quite compelled by that, is you're going to replace one single neuron. You've basically got to replace it with another biological neuron. Like an input-output silicon thing is just not going to be able to do the same thing, have the same causal, play the same causal role in the system. So you actually cannot, given the laws of nature as they are, the properties of carbon versus silicon, you cannot replace the brain in silicon in a way that makes it identical. So there's no pressure from this neural replacement argument to think that consciousness need be substrate independent.
Right. I mean, that's a good point. You might be able to use prosthetics for sensory input, like spectacles or hearing aids, sure, and so on. But as you go into the brain, those kinds of structures are technically not feasible. Maybe according to you, perhaps even logically, not easy to decipher. So, but if the biological substrate is distinct and has properties which are not replaceable by digital substrates, what are those properties in biological substrates? You say chemicals, you say synapses, but are they decipherable by humans about how these substrates work in humans?
But here's, I think, a really nice way in which Susan, and my view, if I understand her correctly, I think we might complement each other in looking in slightly different places for what matters. And Susan is making the case that it's what matters is to be found at the level of quantum mechanics. My intuition, and it may well be wrong, is that what matters is initially at least to be found at the level of things like metabolism and homeostasis, and a property called autopoiesis, which is the property of living systems by which they not only do things, transfer sort of one chemical into another chemical, but they regenerate their own material basis. They recreate their own substrate, if you like. Now, no machines that we build do that. It's a very different kind of thing, and it's a way in which the substrate kind of can bootstrap itself into functional relevance for the rest of the system. So this combination for me of autopoiesis, this self-generating aspect of living systems, together with metabolism, which is a kind of, there's an energy transfer in there. That might be what breathes fire into the sort of the functional descriptions of consciousness.
I'm intrigued by this. I find this fascinating that metabolism and cellular homeostasis could have properties which impact on what consciousness is. But every cell in the body does that. Why is the brain?
So here we get to your necessity but not sufficiency. So these things might be necessary, but they need not be sufficient. And you're absolutely right that some parts of the brain are more tightly tied to consciousness than others. And that's a different level of description. That's a level of, okay, given a sufficient basis, what's your theory of consciousness? Does it emphasize the global distribution of signals in the brain in a global workspace kind of way, or does it focus on the local causal structure of neural networks, in which case you'd isolate different areas of the brain? So believing there's something special and necessary about the living substrate doesn't mean you've got to buy into the fact that consciousness is kind of equally spread out through anything that's alive or any cell. That doesn't follow.
Right. Susan, this idea of some kind of a quantum mechanical interpretation for properties which underlie consciousness. There was a review, I think, in Nature Neuroscience, which Anil authored and co-authored, in which the top 10 theories of consciousness were listed. And I think this possibility, Roger Penrose's ideas, were, if I'm not mistaken, after the top 10, as an add-on. So why do you think that's reasonable? And Anil, why did you put it so down on your list?
Okay, so let me just say that I have a piece coming out as a Target article in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, which I linked to in this piece, called Superpsychism. So it's a grand unified theory, beginning with quantum coherence. That doesn't entail Penrose's view, but it started with a debate Roger and I had during COVID. So we had a really long conversation, and I locked myself at my place for like 3 days and wrote the theory out. So let me just say that, first of all, years ago, I was at the Institute for Advanced Study with the string theorists. So I was reading all the space-time emergence stuff and arguing with them. Not a string theorist, by the way. But I think space-time is emergent. I think there are a range of really cool views on that. And I think that my own view of consciousness is drawing from that. And this is work I did with Mark Bailey recently. We have a couple papers actually coming out on this. So I think that the universe is a web of underlying quantum states that are at root entangled, and they decohere. And when they decohere, there's a theory called quantum Darwinism, which I use to explain how time gets its arrow. So reality starts in a fundamentally timeless situation at the level of entanglements. And as the entanglements decohere and the particles interact in systems, time zero kicks in. Now, the footnote there is that I think that that fundamental layer is a kind of time. I call it proto-time. And that's where I connect it up with panpsychism. And I say that those fundamental units are actually consciousness itself. Okay, so I do bring consciousness all the way down to the very bottom level. You can call that macro consciousness. Now, the next question is, does that mean machines are conscious? By definition, I think it's important to note that in an ordinary sense, when we're asking questions about conscious machines, we're basically asking whether they have what we might call macro consciousness, the kind of consciousness that humans, dogs, cats, and who knows, I mean, maybe it goes all the way down to crabs. I mean, as Anil said, it's really difficult to tell where it starts. And maybe there's no fundamental dividing line, right? I suspect it's just a graded structure. But as things get more complex in certain ways that are detailed in neuroscience, that's where we get to the interesting cases of consciousness. So GPT could be conscious in a really basic panpsychist sense, but that's boring, right? But anyway, I think consciousness starts at the quantum level. Now, you want to hear something really interesting that goes back to the question of whether the universe itself is a quantum computer. So the students always like the simulation hypothesis. If it is, if we're all just in a giant quantum computer, if you will, like a kind of simulation, or maybe it's a natural phenomenon. This goes back to the work of Seth Lloyd years ago over at MIT in his book, Computing the Universe. I hope I got the name right. Then we are all conscious AIs, right? That's really weird to think about. So I think the simulation hypothesis is actually pretty interesting, right? In the question of whether the universe is akin or even a quantum computer.
So Anil, in your list of testable hypotheses on how consciousness works, how would you test such quantum hypotheses? And what are the other testable ones?
I mean, I think that's part of the problem. It's the fact that something is not ever immediately testable doesn't mean it's wrong, right? It just might mean it's not presently testable, and then you have to evaluate its explanatory power. I mean, have yet to be massively convinced by appealing to the quantum level. Maybe that's partly because I prefer to focus on the level where we know things make a difference, like the level of biology. We give someone an anesthetic and consciousness goes away. Now, interestingly, this might be down to a quantum biological effect, but not in the sort of way that rest at all on whether the universe is fundamentally a quantum computer or anything. I mean, there are quantum effects in biology all over the place, in photosynthesis and all sorts of things. And just the pharmacological effect of anesthesia might be quantum. Now, that's a different kind of introduction of quantum to consciousness research. It's much less, I would say, metaphysically ambitious. And these things are a little bit testable too. There's an interesting experiment going on, I think, in Santa Barbara, maybe a couple of other places. Xenon is a potent anesthetic, and there are two isotopes of xenon that differ only in quantum spin. And so there's one old paper that suggested there was a difference in anesthetic effect between these different isotopes. This is now being replicated or attempted to be replicated in a couple of independent replication labs. And if that holds up, that's kind of interesting. You know, it shows, okay, look, there's some sensitivity to spin, which is a quantum property that is determining something about consciousness as it pertains to anesthesia. But it doesn't mean that you have to sort of build in a quantum computer to the universe or go orchestrated objective reduction that Roger Penrose to a Hameroff like. So I focus on what I like to think what we can test. And actually, in a way, it's equally hard to test the hypothesis that life is the thing that makes the difference. But you know, I prefer to get there step by step from looking at the properties of living systems. There's this other challenge to the quantum level, which I think maybe you evade if you build it in right at the fundaments, which is that the brain in general is not a very welcoming place for quantum effects such as entanglement and so on. It's too warm and wet. Now there's ongoing discussion about that, but I don't see it as having like a huge amount of explanatory power yet. But that certainly doesn't mean it's wrong.
Right. So I think, Utsav, don't we have to go on to the questions from the audience?
Yes, you are running out of time, so we'll take a few questions from the Q&A box.
Let's do that.
All the questions which have the maximum upvotes. And there's this question which I also really like. So Manasa has asked that are there any theories that argue against the binary of plainly conscious versus not conscious, but instead for different levels of consciousness, perhaps with a growing consensus of embodied cognition as a philosophy guiding action perception research? In simpler words, does the complexity of biological computational substrate determine the quality of the consciousness in question? And in that case, maybe AI hasn't really reached our level of consciousness. So, Anil, Susan, you share your thoughts.
Yeah. Do you want to go, Susan, or I can go? I don't mind.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, I think most theories are compatible with levels. But there's two ways to interpret it. Like there's overall level, like going from completely unconscious to a somewhat conscious organism to a conscious organism, and there's conscious versus unconscious content. Like, are you consciously aware of a stimulus on a screen or not? But there's a different emphasis. There are theories like global workspace theory, which tend to be a bit more all or none. Either you're conscious of something or you're not. Either you have a global workspace or you don't, maybe. But other theories are much more compatible with things being graded. And I personally think, actually, there's no contradiction with being graded, yet there still being a difference between zero consciousness and some consciousness. It's a little bit like the old this pile of sand paradox. Like, you can add a grain at a time, and at some point you have a pile. There is no specific point at which the pile becomes a pile, but there's still a difference between no sand and some sand. Right, so I think you can have it both ways. I do agree that the complexity of our cognitive architecture does shape the quality of our conscious experiences. The one very quick example I have here is, we humans, we can experience something like regret, as well as sadness and disappointment. But regret, requires the cognitive competence to envisage alternative courses of action and their outcomes, which is quite sophisticated. If you don't have that competence, then you might not be able to experience regret. You might only be able to experience something like disappointment, or even more basically, like just bad, if you can't even envisage the future. There was a wonderful paper in Nature some time ago about trying to do a behavioral experiment to show that rats could experience something like regret and not merely disappointment, which is always one of my favorite papers. They kind of looked wistfully towards the non-chosen option when they got a bad outcome, stuff like that. It was great.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, and I think the AI part of that, the end of it, is really it's orthogonal, right? That still turns on what Susan correctly identified as the core question here. Is computation sufficient? If it is, then yes, the more kind of cognitive computation systems, the wider the range of phenomenology will be. But if it isn't, then it isn't. And you'll have a simulation, a model of something rather than the thing itself.
Yes, Susan, any thoughts?
Well, yeah, just a footnote to what Anil said in response to my view about computation. I just want to mention, so I'm a metaphysician, so the consciousness as coherence at a fundamental level is a metaphysical hypothesis, but you might wonder how it connects to empirical research in neuroscience. And I agree with everything that Anil said there. And I just want to mention, however, that to clarify, when you have coherence, you have between, say, when you have two particles that are entangled and they are in a pure state, the coherence, the entropy, the von Neumann entropy of the entire entangled system is 0. And I take that as a situation of perfect coherence or resonance. And I connect the view up then through the quantum Darwinism move to the resonance theories of consciousness. So that's where it does connect up with the biology, and I do think that there's some important connections there that need to be pursued at the level of neuroscience. So the theory goes from not just the metaphysics, but to the neuroscience. So that's just sort of a view that then ultimately, to connect it back up to the computation issue, suggests that consciousness could involve quantum computation, right? And the real interesting issue here is whether it outruns, from a theoretical, even a theoretical standpoint, the question of whether everything can be simulated by a quantum computer.
With some other questions from the audience?
So I'm going to club 2 questions. These are the last 2 questions I'm going to take because now it's going to be an hour. So Shreyans and Pavitra, they've asked, if computation is not enough for consciousness to emerge, then what occurs in human brains to make them conscious? And the second one is, if we engineer sentience, do we incur ethical obligations typically reserved for biological beings? And how do we measure suffering in artificial minds? So Susan, you can go first. After that, Anil.
Okay, I'll just take the second question because time is short. And I'll just say that I think that the question of suffering is very important, as is the larger question of whether there are any kind of conscious experiences. I mean, maybe the machine can't suffer, but it is conscious nevertheless, right? In that macro conscious way, not just in this low level panpsychist way. Okay, so what I think we need to do is, you could probably tell even from this intriguing conversation that philosophers really, and neuroscientists, do not yet agree on what consciousness is. And so we can't wait for agreement, even though Anil and I actually agree on a lot, but we can't wait for agreement. We urgently need tests for machine consciousness. And that's why I wrote Artificial You. That's one reason, because for years I've developed different tests for artificial consciousness, going back to like 2016. So there's the ACT AI consciousness test, for example, which doesn't presuppose anything about the physical basis of consciousness, okay, or the neuroscientific basis of consciousness. It's just a question and answer test. You can't, though, give it to every kind of AI. That's the problem. But there are other tests as well, like there's the chip test, which I think will tell us an awful lot about substrates. So I'll just quickly say what that is in like 2 lines. it's just the simple idea that as neuroscience begins to replace parts of the brain that underlie consciousness with chips. So think about Neuralink, but they're not doing areas of the brain that underlie consciousness. But think about if we did start to replace those parts with just ordinary computer chips, right? Like made of silicon. Would it be the case that detailed investigation of the patient, together with the patient's verbal reports, indicated that that person was still conscious in the same ways, right? So the question there is just, will some kind of chip ever be suitable, short of it being a biological chip, maybe like created from some sci-fi organoid situation, be sufficient to be replaced? This goes back to the replacement cases that Vijay was talking about, right? In human brains. I think that is a really interesting thing to ask. And I call that the chip test. So I think we will have some kind of insight on this eventually.
Anil, would you like to follow?
Yeah, just I'll keep it short as well. I mean, the short answer, if we engineer sentience, do we incur ethical obligations? Yes. Would they be the same as for biological beings? Well, I mean, it depends. We don't treat all biological beings equally anyway, and we possibly don't live up to the ethical obligations that we have towards some non-human animals. I think that's fairly obvious that we're already doing a pretty bad job of how we distribute our moral concern. So that's certainly true. AI systems could have ethical status even without consciousness, according to some people. Apparently, for some people, agency is enough. I'm not convinced by that, but some people make that argument. But I think sentience, consciousness is a good ground for something having moral status of its own. How do we measure it? Yeah, this is really important. Susan's got, she's developed excellent ideas over the past. There are other ideas. There was a very influential paper led by Patrick Butlin and Robert Long a couple of years ago, where they said, okay, let's take the prominent theories of consciousness and see whether AI systems, in fact, implement these theories, even if in an implicit way. And they concluded that no current AI system does in a rich way, but that future ones might. It's interesting. The caveat with this, which they acknowledge, is it's a very computational view. For that view to make sense, you already have to assume that computation is enough. So, okay, well, that's playing a different game. In my view, that's still looking for the car keys of consciousness where the light happens to be, rather than where it might actually be. Then the first question, if computation is not enough, then what is it? Well, I think in the interest of time, this is kind of what we were talking about. And this to me is the really exciting frontier. If we stop, the short answer is nobody knows. If we stop assuming that it's computation, I think we might come up with very rich and interesting alternative answers, whether it's quantum quantum processes of some kind, or whether it's life processes of some kind, metabolism, autopoiesis, or it could be electromagnetic fields. There's a class of theories that are called field theories of consciousness. There are so many differences between things that we know are conscious, i.e. us, and computers. There are many places to look for things that might make the difference. And that's where I think there's a lot of really exciting work to be done.
So Utsav, can I have a last question?
Yes, please.
So if Dan Dennett were watching you both from upstairs somewhere, what would he say? I mean, to him, it was widgets all the way up. And this is a non-problem, I thought, or a problem which is got too many complexities unnecessarily layered on it. Wouldn't he say that, or would he be agreeing with either or both of you?
Dennett would first say, there's a heaven? What?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
He'd be like, uh-oh, I was wrong.
Yeah.
Dan has two sides, I always thought. The eliminativist side, where he denied consciousness, and the side where he seemed to be taking on just something like a global workspace view, his multiple drafts model, all that stuff, which seemed to me to be very friendly to consciousness. And I think the reconciliation is that he defined qualia very strictly when he rejected qualia, which is a philosopher's expression for consciousness, but builds in a lot of things. And I think he'd find this whole conversation friendly, to be honest. I don't know. What do you think, Anil?
Yeah, I got to know Dan over the last sort of 10 years or so. And one thing that I did recently, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I reread his book, Consciousness Explained, which I'd first read as a starting undergraduate in like the very early 1990s. And on rereading it, I was amazed by how much of it is still super on point. And I just realized, Christ, Dan must be so annoyed with people just asking him the questions which he's answered at length in his book, which everybody cites, but then put on a shelf and forget about it. So there was so much about it that I thought was still really, and so I encourage people to read it. Actually, it's a great book. It stood the test of time. But what would he say now? Well, I mean, we can't. I think it'd be very hubristic to try and put words in Dennett's mouth. But in my conversation with him, he was a sort of the perfect philosopher in the sense that it was never entirely clear what he really thought.
Oh no.
Does he say consciousness doesn't exist or is not what we think it is? Does this would just go back and forth. What he was very clear about was we're often mistaken in our ways of thinking about it. And I always remember, if I can finish this with an anecdote, I remember when I gave a TED talk in 2017. And I was terrified. It's an absolutely terrifying occasion.
Oh, yeah.
Make and break you. There's, and there are 3,000 people in the room, let alone all the people later on going to watch it. You've got one go at it. The one person I was really worried about was Dan. He was in the audience, and I was just like, I don't care, Elon Musk, whatever. Like, what does Dan think? And then afterwards, he was very kind. He said very nice things about it, but he said, one mistake. And I was like, what did I say? And he said, I described consciousness as this kind of multi-sensory, multimodal inner movie. And he said, no, there is no inner movie. That just like, you're just reintroducing the homunculus back in. And he was completely right. And that was one place where I just, I let the kind of narrative temptation get away with me. So I will always remember that, because he was beautifully supportive, but will always pick you up when you've made a logical inconsistency or an error. I think he would be, he was very open-minded. He wasn't dogmatic about things being this way or that way. So I think he would have enjoyed the conversation. I like to think he would. Maybe he is enjoying the conversation.
Thank you very, very much, both of you. I mean, consciousness science has moved from about 30 years ago, when people on the verge of senility or loonies would only go into it. Now, bright young people are entering into this area and tackling the most complex problems. That's because both neuroscience, computer science, and the ability to analyze has changed dramatically recently. So looking forward to more breakthroughs in this area. And thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anil. Thanks, Susan. And thanks to all our attendees for tuning in to this session. And you can also visit Anil and Susan's website, where you'll get like a lot of links to a lot of their articles, research papers, and also the books that they've written. So yeah, it was a great conversation. Hope you have a lovely day, everyone. All right.
And Anil has put on the chat box, as has Susan, links to some of the papers. Anil wrote about that a year ago.
I think that only goes to the panelists, though, right? I think that's not everybody watching, I think.
Right. So if you could give that to the panelists, that'll be good, Utsav.
Yes, I'll just share that with everyone right away. Yes.
Okay. Thank you all. Take care.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Lovely
Thank
evening.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you, Susan.
Bye,
It's great
everyone.
to see you. Bye-bye.
Oh, it was great. That was so interesting.
A lot of
Take
fun.
care, everybody. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Vijay.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both.